We are all hoping that the old way of doing business in Washington is over and that the status quo has ended. We are entering what could be a new era in our country. So with much happening in the nation's capital, I wanted to expand beyond our weekly hour-long podcast to bring you short chats with key players in Washington, from the Senate to the House to President Trump's administration. These discussions will dive into the latest on legislation that's making its way through Congress and the efforts within the administration to drive the MAHA agenda forward. I want to bring these back to you, the American people. You know her as DataRepublican, a digital detective who has taken X by storm, exposing the tangled web of government agencies, media manipulation, and secretive NGOs. Her findings have pulled back the curtain on the corruption within agencies like USAID and the broader fight for truth in an era of manufactured narratives. Today, she joins me, along with her interpreter, to reveal what she's uncovered and share just how deep the rabbit hole goes. DataRepublican, you are an amazing data scientist and researcher. You've asked to remain anonymous, which I think is wonderful, and we will respect. But I do want to thank you for joining us today for this update from Washington. And while you are not necessarily in this administration, what you have done is extraordinary. You have mined and sifted through tens of thousands, probably millions of data points at this point, documents and data points. And the work that you have done to expose fraud and government mismanagement has been incredible. It's been highlighted in the X community by individuals like Elon Musk, Mike Cernovich, Jack Posobiec. Your investigative work is exceptional. So thank you so much for joining me today. You have uncovered that USAID has funneled nearly $500 million into an outfit called Internews Network, a secretive NGO that has worked with thousands of media outlets worldwide. What else can you share with us about your investigation into this group, and why are taxpayer dollars going to media organizations in other countries?
Yes. May I call you Nicole?
Of course.
Thank you. Wonderful. So thank you, Nicole, for introducing me. I really want to clarify my role here and my expertise. Mike Benz, he is the true expert. He has all the understanding. He's like a historian and he studies these things. What I do is develop tools to analyze these things, and I use AI to figure out new connections and new facts. Not necessarily like Mike Benz, but I do build tools, so please keep that in mind. I am just a tool builder. So about Internews, to answer your question, recently it was the topic of a recent WikiLeaks thread. I did some research, and what I figured out, they have a pension of around $125 million a year. $95 million of that is from government money. Now it's being spread out and granted to smaller charities and different things throughout the world. Now what happened after that is not exactly clear to me. I know that people say, that they're trying to finance a color revolution around the world. But I have not personally made that connection. That's not my role. I'm keeping my opinion out of it. I just look at the data. So what the AI found was very interesting. It was the fact that on the board at Internews, there's one person who sits on the board who is also the vice president of communications at Reddit.
Wow.
And that's interesting because Reddit has been often accused of spreading propaganda for the government. So, does that answer your question?
That is fascinating. I've often wondered why Reddit is so heavily leaning towards what was the Democratic Party's messaging, the globalist messaging. The attacks on Donald Trump really were deeply harbored on Reddit, and I won't go on Reddit because I find it too chaotic for me. But I had no idea that that was a link that you had found, and that is a link that exists. Um, one, I saw one post that cited Internews in its own internal documents, admitting that it isn't just about producing news. It's about using media as a lever to affect social and political transformation. Not news, social and political transformation. That's not what the American people think of when we think of a free press, obviously. Um, is this an NGO straight up telling us that they're involved in color revolutions around the world, paid for by American taxpayer dollars?
Again, Mike Benz is the better person to ask about this. But from what I understand, is that during the Cold War, we set up many departments and programs and NGOs in order to prevent the spread of communism around the world. And part of that, Internews was involved with. Now, I've had people from Hungary, from Poland, and other USSR countries that tell me, it was a big thing for them to have an American radio in their country. It helped them fight communism. At one point, Internews had a clear mission, and it was to stop the spread of communism throughout the world during the Cold War. But I think the big question is really, now it's been 35 years since communism collapsed, but the finances to all these NGOs just continue to grow. So what are we doing with it now if it's not stopping the spread of communism? So I don't understand where all this money is going and why these funds keep getting bigger. It's weird.
It's weird. It almost seems like it has somehow been captured by groups that want to spread chaos. So USAID isn't just paying media outlets around the world. It's funding actually things going on here in the United States as well, which is problematic because USAID stands for um, international development. It's an agency for international development.
Yeah, I think the reason why we're figuring this out now is because it's so complicated. We are deep in the weeds here. It required AI algorithms to even understand how deep these connections go. I had to do a lot of research to this. What happens is that, again, it goes back to communism. In 1983, we made an NGO called the National Endowment for Democracy, and it had both Republicans and Democrats involved. The NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and the National Republican Institute, these two, it's spreading money for the world to support democratic incentives. But what they're actually doing is not super clear now. A lot of USAID money actually goes into different entities. The interesting thing is, though, one of the biggest USAID receivers of this money is called CEPPS, CEPS, the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening. But they have a lot of USA money going into there, billions into CEPS. It's in the form of small awards like development in Venezuela, in Georgia. So it has these labels for helping to develop smaller countries. But in reality, CEPPS, CEPS, is one big pot. And so a certain percentage goes to the Republicans, the IRI, and a certain percentage goes to the Democrats, the NDI, and then another group, the International Foundation for Election Systems, the IFES.
Wow.
Then these three groups also separately receive their own USAID money. They receive double USAID money, first from CEPS, then from USAID directly. Then if you want to back up, the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, that one accepts money from the Department of State. Then they also give money back to the NDI and to the Republicans, and they also finance Internews Network. I'm sorry, it's so hard to explain because it's so complicated.
You're doing an incredible job. I mean, it sounds like what's happening is that there's all of these channels for billions and billions upon billions of taxpayer dollars going to organizations whose mandates are unclear what their mandate is to do exactly with this money. It gives them exceptional control over the democracy. Democracy is supposed to be amongst the people. But when you give it to limited organizations funded by individuals who are not responsible for disclosing what the money is specifically designed to do, you then have a capture of our democratic system entirely by this small group of people who's doing the grant making.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. This is my first interview. I was just going to say, the really interesting thing is that all the organizations that we've discussed so far have major, powerful politicians on their boards. We're talking about individuals, for example, like Lindsey Graham. Oh, yes, so she was talking about Steny Hoyer, the former Democratic representative from Maryland. All these people are very powerful, and they sit on the board for these things. And there are all these politicians that are in control of money that isn't going to where it should be going. If the American people saw this, there would be outrage.
Yeah, the American people are seeing it. Thanks to you, they're seeing it. And I have to say, the ones who understand what this means is that our democratic system and the democratic system in these other countries that are receiving the money, democratic system, um, they are being controlled by this very small shadow group. When we talk about the deep state and the shadow group that is running the world and controlling elections around the world, this is specifically the pot of money we're talking about. This is specifically the group of people we're concerned about. They are, the puppet masters. When we talk about the puppet masters, like who is actually controlling these elections? Are these free and fair elections? They cannot be free and fair elections if there is a small group flooding money in to the infrastructure of the democracy, the operating model of the elections. They control every piece of it, from the messaging at Internews, from the election systems, the integrity systems, the organizations, the parties. So if they control it all, do we actually have true democracy? Do we have a free press? No. The answer is no. And that is what you're showing us. Um, you've written on your Substack about why you believe we should eliminate the Department of Education. And you believe that we ought to redirect those resources to parents and empower schools to innovate. What people don't understand about the federal Department of Education is that they're basically a bureaucratic office that tells the states what they need to do. It doesn't actually put supplies into our system. It doesn't help teachers. It doesn't go to aid in the actual education of our children. It's a bureaucratic layer from the federal government that controls the freedom of the states and controls the freedom of the schools. So the schools have no freedom. They're suppressed under these big layers. First federal government, then the state layer, then you have the county layer. And by the time you get to these poor teachers, they're crushed under the weight of this bureaucracy. So you've written in your Substack beautifully. I encourage everyone to go to it. Federal standards have locked us into a rigid system that fails to accommodate diverse learning needs. This matters to me because I'm an autism mom. I want my child, who I know learns differently. I have a sense of how she learns, but the public school system can't provide that environment.
Yes, thank you for sharing that with me. I have an autistic child myself. Like I said, my child is very, very smart. Yes, got the autism, but sometimes those types of people have bad judgment, so he actually needs a full-time aide in school to help him. He really also needs therapy, but we have a 504, which means what? It's a medicine accessible form. That 504 allows him to have an aide to keep him safe because sometimes he can be a little wild. But the school won't give him an IEP because he needs to have an IEP to get the aid. But they say his learning is not impacted, so he doesn't need an IEP. He can do math, he can read. He can read, he can spell, he's brilliant. And that's why they don't give him an IEP. And it's really frustrating because it frustrates me. It feels so arbitrary. Anyway, with the Department of Education, the big question is you have $238 billion to spend every year. And before that, you had control of billions of dollars. Can you honestly look me in the eye and tell me that you would decide the best way to help the children, the best way to spend that huge pile of money was to put all this billions of dollars into Washington, D.C. and allow Bill Gates to control how we educate our children? I think not. All of that money going right to Washington does nothing at the local level for the people who need it.
It does nothing. It just builds up more and more bureaucracy and capture in DC. That doesn't end up in our classrooms, our local classrooms, one bit. Well, I think you said that beautifully.
And all the rules are so arbitrary that it makes no sense. I'm sure you've had some experience with that as a mom yourself.
Yeah, I agree. Too much bureaucracy. It's crippling. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on. I know this was your first interview. You've had many big news outlets reaching out to you, and you chose to come on mine. I'm really humbled by that. I'm really grateful to you. And I can't emphasize how valuable it is, the engineering you've done to sift through the statistics and bring it back to the people. Thank you.